I'm going to pause the recording. Okay, so I'm going to say, first of all, I'm going to say hi, everybody. In this new way of working, obviously, we're all supposed to be able to see each other. I'm not necessarily going to leave my presentation on for all the time, but I thought I'd just say hello and say welcome to the TMF Reference Model meeting. The world's a very strange place, as we all know, and it's lovely to have everybody online, and I hope that you are all well. And welcome to, for those of you who've not joined these calls before, welcome to the TMF community. We'd like to have we're hopefully going to have a good hour of entertainment in terms of talking about TMFs and talking about impacts on TMFs and having hopefully too much fun in a time that's maybe a little more difficult. So with that, I'm going to switch my camera off, and I'm going to start the presentation. So if anybody has any problems, please put the comments into the chat box and somebody will help you. So today's agenda, we are looking at a few sort of updated pieces of information, membership update, a little bit about the forums and the steering committee, and then we're going to go into two bigger presentations, one which is one I'm sure you're very interested in, which is the COVID-19 and the TMF, and the other one is the MHRA GCP Symposium summary, and talk a little bit about events. Of course, that's probably being slightly wishful thinking, but there are still events that are happening on TMF at the end of the year, and we're hoping that the world will be back to normal and we'll all be able to get together and give each other hugs at that point in time. So just a little update for those of you who don't know how many people we actually have, and as part of the TMF reference model, there's a very large group of people, and we have people being added constantly. So we have 317 project team members. These are the people that are actually involved in projects, and we have 998 subscribers, in other words, who get information. We obviously have a big LinkedIn group. Again, it's growing all the time. And I'll talk a little bit about communication on the next slide. Just one thing to note very quickly, that the Yahoo group forum is actually closed and it's being scheduled for deletion tomorrow. As you know, Yahoo stopped the communication. So we had to get rid of the Yahoo group. So just a quick note, first of all, thank you very much to Eldon for all the work that he does, Eldon Rammel, all the work he does on in the background, sorting us out in terms of communications. We just wanted to make a couple of quick comments about the online forums. So Eldon has been going through and sorting out forums by subject topic. So therefore you can have information about specific subjects or topics rather than necessarily having just the individual feeds. So you can subscribe to these topics and get the information sent through to you and have daily digest sent through to you on these particular online forums. It's lovely to see how many people are using them now. I regularly you can see information coming through from the forums. So the other thing I'd like to talk about is the steering committee. Every year around about this time, we have nominations. Everyone serves a 3-year term, and so therefore people have to stand again, or other people can stand. And as you know, we put out a call to say who would like to stand for the steering committee. One word of thanks, which I actually didn't put on the slides, apologies, but just to say to somebody who is stepping down, so Scott McCulloch, who is stepping down from the steering committee, thank you very much for all your work and support to date, Scott. We'll miss you and wish you all the best. I'm sure we'll still stay in contact, so no problems there, but thank you very much. So in terms of where we are with the steering committee, there are 5 current vacancies, and we have had 8 nominations. The nominees are on the right-hand side. Fran, Jamie, Lisa, and Todd at the bottom are all standing again. They've been on the steering committee. And we have Donatella, Donna, Elvin, and Mamoru, who are all standing as new potential candidates for the steering committee. So just so you know, the steering committee, there's some strict rules about being part of the steering committee. There's a percentage attendance required, and we have a charter that we follow, which it makes this group a more formal group. So details about these candidates can be found on the website. You will be getting an email from invitations@mail.electionbuddy.com to ask you to vote. Now, voting will stay open until the 10th of April. There is a possibility that the email doesn't get through to you. So, and that's because all of our spam filters sometimes block things. And unfortunately, if it doesn't get through to you, it means it's been sent. You need to then go and ask your IT if they can release it. Sometimes, though, they just can't seem to get through. Eldon, I know you're on and this is your area of expertise. Is there any other advice you can give to people about how to get the emails?
I think the main thing is just to ensure that if you're able to update your whitelist, or to allow which domains you're allowed to receive email from, if you add electionbuddy.com to those. If you're expecting the email and you don't receive it immediately after this meeting, you leave it an hour or so. Then if you haven't received it, the only way of getting it is to contact your IT guys and say, I was expecting an email through from this domain. Could you please release it from the spam filters?
And this will only be for the people that are on the TMF reference model. In other words, it will be out of, if I just go back a couple of slides, out of this group, who are the people that will be receiving the emails? That's
correct. So it will be those 317 or whatever it is as of today, those who are registered on groups.io.
Okay, not the subscribers, no, but the project team members.
Yeah.
Okay, so if you're just part of a LinkedIn group or a subscriber, don't be surprised if you don't get an email. Okay, so exciting times, weird times. And at this point in time, I'd like to hand over to our three presenters. So, Kathy, I think I can actually hand you the remote control. So if you give me 1 second, hang on a second.
Are you going to have to post the polling questions, Karen?
Probably.
So maybe if you want to hang on to it until after that's done, or?
Okay.
Yeah.
No worries at all. Okay. Let me take it back. Good point. I'll carry on to the polling questions and then I'll hand it over to you because it's just easy if you drive your own slides, as I worked out.
That sounds perfect.
Now.
Great.
Okay, over to you.
Okay. Hi, everyone. We have decided to prepare a presentation on the potential impacts and considerations of COVID-19 on your trial master file. And we're doing that in a couple of sections and in collaboration with a number of colleagues on the TMF Reference Model Steering Committee. So I'm going to start out with a few polling questions and a review of the health authority guidance. And then we're going to move on to talk about, Lisa's going to talk about the impact on TMF and eTMF processes, and Sholay will talk about the impact on documentation. And obviously, we could make this a 3-hour presentation. So we're trying to just hit some high points. There'll probably be more material on our slides than we actually present, and we look forward to continuing the dialogue. Next, Karen. Do we have the polling questions before or after this?
I'm muted after this. So you do this slide and then the polling questions.
Okay, great. So as just a little bit of background, that a lot of health authorities have recently issued advisory or guidance documents on COVID-19 and specifically on clinical studies. So we've decided to prioritize review of this guidance and to prepare some materials on the potential impact. So although the three of us named here will be leading the discussions, you may hear from other of the steering committee members that have important points to raise. And it's also important to understand we're not trying to provide you with guidance on you need this particular document or you should be performing this particular practice. What we'd like to do is introduce some points to consider. And we're, again, interested in continuing this dialogue with the whole community on an ongoing basis, so we can use the mechanisms that Karen described just now, the postings and shared areas. We can continue to discuss during our meetings as things evolve. But we're looking forward to continuing our discussions.
Okay, so I'm now going to launch a couple of polls. Can I ask somebody to please, once the poll is finished and I publish it, can somebody just take a screenshot or a clip of it and send it to me, because I can't get it back, and then I'll put them in the slides.
Hey Karen, it's Fran. I'll grab a screenshot for you.
Thank you, Fran. Thank you very much. Right, okay. So the first poll we're going to launch is about your organization, to get a bit of a view on what you've been doing with regards to COVID-19. And there are two questions. One is that, and the other one is, what is the impact on the TMF? So if you'd all like to vote, first one is multiple choice, second one is select one answer. There are 221 of you on the call, so we are expecting a decent number of people to answer, please. Some of you are logged in by phone and by computer, so I would guess probably we should be able to get to 100 and something. I have to say that if anybody, as they're answering these questions, the chat is a great place to share comments. So when we look at the answers, for example, if you have done something like suspended some or all of your trials, it would be good to understand, you know, whether it's more likely all or whether it's some. We didn't actually split the two things out. Some interesting answers. I'm gonna leave it going because we're at 120, so I'm going to leave it going probably to about, it's still climbing up a reasonable number, to about 140, 150. Jen, you're asking, can the poll be accessed for participants joining via the web browser? You should be able to, but I have absolutely no idea how. Somebody on a web browser, can someone tell us how to do it?
It just popped up for me, Karen.
Yeah,
Maybe
me too.
Pop-up blocker, maybe?
Oh, that's the point. Jen, look at your pop-up blocker. Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, Suzanne.
It may be, I mean, there is another way of joining Zoom. Most people probably downloaded the app automatically when you went into the meeting, but there is also a web browser version of Zoom, and it's possible these polls aren't supported in the web browser only version.
I joined way of the web browser, and it popped up for me. But that might be because I've allowed the pop-ups from Zoom before.
Okay.
So thanks for that, Todd, that I did that way.
Perfect. Thanks, everybody. 142, 43. Okay, I'm going to count down. If it goes to 144, I'm going to end the polling. Right, I'm ending the polling. Hang on, 144 people have answered this. That's a really good, oh, 145. Right, that's it. Right, share the results. So Kathy, over to you to talk about the results.
Okay, great. So 59% have performed a risk analysis. I think that's pretty impressive. 25% have suspended some or all trials, and 62% have already modified their site monitoring practice, which is one area where we definitely anticipate a big impact. But only 40% have documented changes in procedures. So that sounds like an area that, and Cholet and Lisa are going to talk about that more, but an area to think about. And again, modified or deviated from SOPs at 28%. And then we have some people that don't know or that no steps are taken. But I guess the takeaway from that is that a lot of people are doing the risk analysis and monitoring and modifying their site monitoring practices. And then in our second part, we have what's your biggest concern? And we have 8% that say we don't quite understand what the health authorities are looking for. And I think when we talk about the guidance, we'll actually see some areas that aren't blindingly obvious that they might be looking for. So I can understand that. But the biggest one here, that the TMF won't include all the necessary risk assessments, justifications, and documentations of deviations. Then we have 25% concerned about business continuity, and at the bottom, 17% think that this won't have much impact on their TMF at all. And there are reasons to think that, and we'll talk about that too. So thanks everyone who responded. Any comments, Karen, before we move on?
No, I was just going to say there's a couple of questions and comments in the chat, but actually I think if you carry on, for example, Liz has made a comment which actually relates to topics later. So maybe all the presenters could have a look at the questions as they're presenting. And it's most likely Sholay and Lisa who might be able to incorporate answers or comments in their presentation. So in the interest of time, I'm going to stop sharing the results and I am going to go back to the presentation. And I am going to hand the remote to you, Kathy.
Great.
And then you can take control, which means I think I can't touch my mouse. Actually, no, I think I can. Oh, no,
okay.
I can't.
So I think I have control now.
Oh, dear.
Okay. So in reviewing the health authority guidance, there's some trends that I noticed. So first and foremost, and not surprising at all of the health authorities stress that patient safety is the first consideration. So they talk about things like there can be emergency decisions based on patient safety that don't need to be cleared with the health authority beforehand, but it's extremely important to report those to both the health authorities and the ethics committees afterwards. Some of them actually recommend explicitly to document your risk assessments. Several of them mention protocol deviations and sometimes in some detail, that they are expecting these to occur, but in general, they don't need to be reported to the health authority unless they put the participants at risk. And then some
Kathy,
other
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but in my view of your presentation, I only see the introductory slide. I don't see the one with the bullets.
I'm only on the introductory one at the moment.
If you go to the next slide, I thought that's okay.
The next slide, I think, is talking about the FDA specifically. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So this is just kind of a little bit of a roundup before we jump in. Yeah, so other common topics you see, remote monitoring, sometimes more emphasis on centralized monitoring, distribution of the IP directly to the patients if necessary. And in a lot of ways, though, you might say, and you're 17% of people that voted, nothing much has changed. In a way, that's true. You still need to follow your procedures. You still need to document deviations. But obviously, the health authorities think that something's changed. They issued these new guidance documents. And in a lot of cases, they're really just reinforcing and clarifying their existing expectations. And that's kind of what we're doing, the three of us are doing in this presentation as well, is everyone's concentrating on patient safety, of course, rightly so. But at the end, all of the documentation needed to reconstruct the trial will be needed to be in the trial master file. So just some things to think about to make sure that you really are collecting all of the documents in a timely manner. So now I'm going on, hopefully did my slide advance, Lisa, now to FDA?
Yep.
Oh, great.
It did, yes.
Okay, and by the way, there's links to all of these guidance documents in the presentation, and what I'm focusing on in my part is really the areas that touch on documentation. So of course, these guidance documents cover much more than that, but we'll talk about some key points here that relate to documentation. So FDA starts out by talking about safety considerations and then says those will have an impact on things like recruitment and monitoring, patient discontinuations, and that all of those in turn generate a need to inform sponsors, sites, IRBs, and patients. So all of those communications, of course, will take various forms, but will probably end up needing to be filed in the trial master file to show that all of the processes were followed. The urgent protocol changes should be discussed with the IRBs. If necessary, they would be discussed with the FDA, but they again might be implemented without prior approval and reported afterwards. Sponsors and clinical investigators should document how restrictions related to COVID-19 change their study duration, their study contact, all of those aspects of the trial. So again, all of this sort of deviation documentation and changes to plans, changes to other documents. They were one of the agencies that mentioned that they expect a lot more protocol deviations due to changes in visit schedules, missed patients, discontinuations. They mentioned explaining that info in the case report form. And then, of course, eventually all of it needs to make its way into the clinical study report. They talked about alternative distribution methods for the study drug, but emphasized that all of the accountability requirements remain in place. You need to have a complete documentation for the whole supply chain. And they suggested before you change things like data management plans or statistical analysis plans that you consult with your FDA review division. And that again would give you that whole paper trail of the documentation of the consultation that took place, the updates to the plans, the whole package of documents that are needed to reconstruct the changes made to the trial. Next, we'll talk a little bit about the EMA's guidance. Now, this is a pretty extensive guidance document compared to some of the others. It covers an awful lot of points. And like other health authorities, they talked about, oh, hang on.
Oh, sorry.
I think.
No, that was my fault.
Yep. Back to the EMA.
Sorry about that, Kathy. Just one quick comment as I interrupt. Hang on, let me just give you back the there you are. You've got the screen again. Sorry, I went to reply to somebody in the chat and unfortunately messed things up. Just a quick comment to say I think we might need to speed up through this piece, Kathy, because otherwise we won't get to the TMF piece. So maybe just sort of quick highlights per slide.
I will then. Yep. So a couple of things I found interesting in this guidance. Sponsors are advised to pre-plan how systematic deviations resulting from these decisions are captured. And they also talked about some things that I hadn't heard about before or hadn't really thought about before. So for example, the need to temporarily delegate your principal investigator to a sub-investigator. They also talked about transferring subjects from one site to another, which isn't something you would normally need to do. And even potentially, although they don't really want you to do this, opening new sites because the old sites aren't able to support the patients. The possible need to reconsent patients and additional compensation that's needed to either the subjects or the sites to handle this. That would all have to be documented. And one thing I really thought was news you could use, mark any contact with the national competent authorities with COVID-19 in the subject field if that is relevant to your communications. Health Canada, this is a fairly brief guidance, a lot of things that are in others, but they do specifically mention, which I don't think is true for all health authorities, that when you halt recruitment or temporarily halt the trial, you have to report that in a CTAN to them. Otherwise, a lot of the same themes, but they touched on the need to use other alternatives if you can't get wet ink signatures. So they talked about electronic signatures, for example. And then MHRA has two posts, actually. These are blog posts. The first one is advice for management of clinical trials, and the second one talks about inspections. So they are one of the ones that recommends conducting and documenting a brief risk assessment, talking about additional or different ways to monitor, like phone calls or video calls, which would be an interesting thing to have to document. And they talk about using alternatives such as email confirmation instead of a wet ink signature, which wouldn't normally be acceptable if you said that you required a signature. And let's see what else I have here. Oh, the one thing I did want to mention there was about the inspections. They say that because of the coronavirus outbreak, they're only conducting essential on-site inspections. However, they emphasize we are expecting organizations to maintain GXP compliance in the interim as inspections are deferred to a later date. And then finally, I'm not even going to talk about the details here, but just today, there are more guidance is emerging from different health authorities. So here are some examples: Danish, Norwegian, the NHS, Italy, Netherlands. So the takeaway here is don't just look at this list. It's probably not exhaustive. Check your health authority's guidance frequently because there may be emerging guidance at any point. And that's pretty much what I have. So I'm going to hand over to Lisa now.
Thanks, Kathy. If you would just stay the controller of the slides.
Sure.
So thanks everyone. I'm really, it was really interesting to start to pull together what we wanted to present regarding now the impacts on trial master file management documentation. And when I started doing that, we found two camps. There is the documentation, but also the process by which the documentation is created. And I know that that is not directly associated with an artifact in our TMF, but it is if you think of if you go down the lane with me. So next slide. So most importantly, in a general sense, that if documentation processes change, you got to document the change, right? So this is about every one of us as TMF professionals reaching out to our study teams and listening and being very acutely aware of where the documentation that is coming into the TMF is going to look different, is going to come in a different method, and know that that might be against our processes. So our processes need to be updated, or they need to be documented right now and maybe even deviated, okay? And I would caution, as Kathy brought up earlier, is that we have to watch for the creation of new documentation because, you know, at TMF, processes are not new. We have them rooted solidly in foundational process, right, of creation, of maintenance of our documentation, but we will get new documentation. And remember that will impact the master TMF inventory as well as study-specific TMF inventories. And you might even consider the creation of a new document. Maybe it's stored at 151. Is that one? No, that's wrong. It's 153. Forgive me. Oh my gosh, I got that wrong. To capture an overall summary of the process changes. So for example, if you're doing, if you note previously did not allow a document to be an email confirmation letter, I know that's probably strange in today's world, but now it's going to be email because you can't wet ink, or the wet ink signature is not going to appear. Well, that is a change to the documentation, which then has a downstream effect of the change to the QC of the documentation. So the record quality is going to change as well. And then that's a very important document to maintain, because in 2 years' time, in 1 year's time, in 3 years' time, when you are writing when your organization is writing the CSR, people are going to be like, what did we do? And was this a change because of the COVID ID, period of time? Well, we're going to have that as a general listing. Next. So if we go into, next slide, Kath.
I'm trying.
If we go into, sorry, documentation, and I know this was brought up as part of one of the challenges that we're having, is that previously wet ink documentation, it could be protocol signature page, it could be a green light documentation, it could be UAT documentation. But you know what, we have to take a look and, oh, can you go backwards? We have to take a look and see what is that wet ink documentation that we would expect. And then I have some delay. I'll just go to mine.
Sorry, my
there we go.
keys are sticking.
That's okay. And we have to take a look and say, okay, do we expect that wet ink, and can it be scanned? Do we have the parameters by which the document can be scanned? Do we have that? Can everybody scan a document according to those parameters, right? 300 DPI, etc. So, and what is the process if not? So I think this slide is all about identifying where you can allow things to move into a non-wet ink or a wet ink scan document. And then lastly is, okay, do we collect all those wet inks? Because now they're distributed across the world. So for example, we put out in one of my clients a good documentation practice, which is create a new folder, make it very obvious on your home desk, and put all your wet inks in that folder so that when the time comes and you can send that documentation in for somebody who's able to receive it in the office, you have it all together. Okay. You have to consider whether or not email approvals, just like the MHRA said, are we allowed to do email approvals? And what would you do with that email approval? Would you append it to the document, or how would you tag it in the system, or how would you tag these two documents together? Because you may not have a signature page, but if you are allowing emails. And then lastly, maybe we just need a good study decision log as well to summarize instead of having these official wet ink documents. But you know what? This is a really great opportunity to go through and really bring the organization on board to do electronic signatures. So reach out, reach out, reach out. I know it might require some UAT, so it would, and a validation effort, but many of you probably, if you have an eTMF already validated and just aren't using that functionality. And lastly, this is going to come up, is that people are going to want to take photographs of documentation. And you have to determine for your organization, where is your stance on that? Because not every home office has a copier, has a printer, has a scanner. Okay, so I'm not telling you the answer now, but you have to establish for your organization if you're going to allow pictures. Next. Inspections are going to go forward. So yes, they might not be coming as quickly, but we don't know when the COVID ID pandemic is finished or whether or not it's going to come back in the fall. And what business as usual is going to resume. So perfect way to start getting people involved with a discussion about remote access to your TMF or your eTMF, which might include, if it's paper-based, to electronically scan all that documentation. Not now, please don't go and do 100% scan if that's not your process. But think about in this time where you would have to present a paper TMF, what would you do and how would you ensure a quality process? Not only creation, but QC, of provision, of tracking, etc. Next. So the other piece we have to think about, and I know this isn't necessarily for my paper TMF folks out there, but we do have to think about the impact on how people access the TMF documentation in an electronic environment. So we have to also, as one of the health authorities said, hey, tag impacted documents that are being sent to me with COVID ID-19, okay? But we shouldn't only leave that to that document. It should be a lot of them. So another client of mine is now doing remote-based monitoring, but they wanted to know which of those monitoring visits were impacted. So they're tagging those in the system with a unique, remote or COVID ID identifier so we can find those. If you have a paper process to provide access to any of the systems, even the shared drive, whatever, think about how you need to make that now a more electronic process, using even e-signatures or e-approvals. And this one is tricky. We're all doing UAT, and it might be that you just have to visualize people's completion of every page of their UAT. Because you can't see them in order to sign it off. So we're going to get creative. We're going to have to, but the most important thing is you're going to document. You're going to document where you had the change and why it was changed. And I'm not surprised. I wouldn't be surprised if actually some of these new ways of working creep into our normal business when we return. Next. Okay. So I'm going to turn that over to Shalay. These are only a few of the ways that are impacting, and I know there are a ton of other ways, but we wanted to highlight. Now I turn it over to Shalay to highlight some of those TMF-specific documentation issues.
Great. Thank you so much, Lisa. So good morning, afternoon, everyone, depending on your location in the world. This is Sholay, ex-IVAN. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about the impact on TMF documentation. So one thing I want to highlight is that this is not unique to COVID-19. What we see happening now, if you have events that occur on your study, that should be documented. So this is not, it shouldn't be anything new, but it may be a good time for us in the TMF world to remind our stakeholders, data management, ClinOps, et cetera, that this is not a good time to push the TMF to the side, if you will. ICH GCP Release 2 tells us that the TMF has to be contemporaneous with the clinical trial. So anything that's happening within the clinical trial, of course, has to be documented. Next slide, please. So just a couple of reminders, again, here on this slide. One thing that I want to highlight, I'm not going to read this word for word, is just the protocol deviation. Make sure that those are tracked and documented appropriately. We are seeing the number of deviations increasing, so just making sure that that information is documented. Kathy and Lisa talked about protocol amendments. So of course, making sure that information is documented within the TMF. Next slide, please. There seems to be an uptick in meetings, so just making sure that additional meetings have the appropriate documentation, agenda, minutes, et cetera, filed into the TMF. Another thing for me to highlight right here is the decisions log, as Lisa mentioned earlier. The decisions log is your friend. Making sure that you properly document any changes that are happening, any revisions that are happening, et cetera, and try to avoid using notes to file. This can be an easy way out, but it's not the best way out. So we've talked about the overuse of notes to file multiple times. Just a quick reminder to use your decisions log. Next slide, please. Any communication with IRBs, making sure that that information is documented and filed into the TMF. And as Kathy mentioned earlier, ensuring that the revisions are properly documented in the CSR. Next slide, please. So a few last thoughts just from the information that Kathy, Lisa, and I presented today. So all of these changes, all of these challenges will bring a delay in getting TMF documents, especially if you have a paper TMF. So just keep that in mind. Understand the type of documentation that will be generated to manage the clinical operations during this pandemic to determine the filing. Ensure that you have an understanding in the new way that you could possibly be working and collaborating with study teams now that we're all remote, most of us, and working from home, et cetera. Look for more efficient ways of doing processes that have typically been done maybe in a more archaic way. Just because it's been done that way forever doesn't mean that it's still the way that you have to work moving forward. As Lisa mentioned, consider electronic signatures and approvals instead of wet ink. The priority is to get your virtual TMF management and inspection processes in place now, because it looks like that's going to be more of a reality moving forward. Next slide, please. Focus on the documentation and the management of decisions in the TMF to support the summary and the CSR. Again, very important and something that's been highlighted with the regulations that we've seen. Assessing the risk during the time is vitally important, and according to the poll, many of you have been doing that. As risk is assessed and action is taken, communicate that along the way to stakeholders and document that as well. Ensure that documentation is in the TMF. Remember that the TMF tells the story of the clinical trial. The documentation in your TMF will be used to reconstruct the clinical trial. So it's important to make sure that your study is not missing any chapters. Okay, next slide. Thank you all very much.
I know we are short on time and we went over, Karen. Didn't know if there was any key parts that our presentation missed that any of our steering committee members or any of our members want to bring up quickly.
Hey, hi, this is Mary Christine. Just quickly, I think that, I mean, that was great presentation. And I just want to maybe emphasize the fact that what it's key for us in the TMF space is to really to understand the dynamic that's happening due to this pandemic, right? And to understand the nature of the new documentation, where is it going to be filed? But honestly, yes, it's a major event, but it's a major event like, you know, any other event that may happen that is generating documentation. So in terms of overall TMF management process requirements, the key message I think is really, it's even more important to be on the top of the TMF than ever, and to closely monitor, you know, this wave of new documentation and new ways of doing things more than ever as well. So my recommendation is really for the TMF professionals, TMF groups, TMF operations, etc., is to be very proactive and to reach out to the clinical operations lines to understand what's happening and be on the top of, you know, the TMF management. So that's my message. Yeah.
Hi, it's Donna Dorzinski. Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Donna.
Hi, it's Donna. I just had one additional thought as I was looking through the guidances over the last week. One of the things that really stood out to me is the whole need for risk management. And when you think about ICH E6R2, risk is definitely the focus of it. In organizations that have robust risk management plans in place, this is a great place to capture a lot of the activities that your organization will be taking to mitigate this. And what's really neat about that is if you're doing that, then that's an awesome tool to reference during your completeness reviews, right? Because if everything's being captured there in terms of the activities, it's going to be a clue to those of us doing the reviews as to what we need to be looking for, right? Because companies are really good at saying, hey, we're going to do all this, but then getting them to document it and then the challenge of getting them to put it in the TMF, I think that might be a really nice place to try and capture this.
Mm-hmm. Good point.
Yep. Agree.
Great. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Marie-Christine and Donna, for your input. And thank you all. Again, as Kathy and Lisa said, we could talk about this topic forever, for hours. So I'll turn it over to next speaker. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And I realize now why my conversation seemed to be very strange, because I'd muted one machine, but not the main thing. So apologies. I've been talking to you for the last 10 minutes and not talking, as we all do on these things. So I just wanted to say thank you very much and say there was a couple of points that were raised in the chat, specifically around wetting signatures and people's sort of concerns about using DocuSign, etc., or whatever system people have got. And I think this is an ideal opportunity, as people have said, to try and bring people into the digital signing type of thing. And I think that there needs to be a risk assessment done, which is if you don't have a DocuSign that is set up specifically in line with all of the requirements, is that a good risk to take? Because actually it's still signing documents electronically, it just might not have reasons for signing and things like that. I think the other comments that have been made just show that the guidance is changing all the time. So keep an eye, everyone's doing blogs, everyone's doing guidance documents. We will try and keep you up to date, and we will post these slides up, and we will post anything up as well. Is anybody who made any other comments, is there anything that anybody else would like to add, either from the steering committee or additional? So I think what I'd like to do, if that's okay, is actually take us away and finish off not talking about COVID-19, but actually hand over to Wendy to do unfortunately, Wendy, a rather quick summary of the MHRA FDA GCP Symposium. But since this was quite a while ago, I think it's good that we do it at this meeting. And I'm just checking that Wendy can. I'm going to unmute you, Wendy. Hi, Wendy. Can you hear me? Got you. There you are.
Hi, sure. Can you hear me okay? I was going to say I can speak quickly, and if you can advance the slides for me, that would be great.
Yep. No problem at all.
This was the MHRA FDA GCP Symposium that was held in London on February 13th and 14th. Next slide. What's interesting is a lot of the key things that they focused on are very applicable now with the pandemic going on. So really it's important, I think, to share at this meeting the collaboration that we've been seeing over the past few years with the agencies. And this is an example of the MHRA FDA collaboration. And you know, it was a great, for those of you who attended, even if you streamed day one, I think you'll agree it was a really informative symposium. And I'm not going to read through all the slides, but the key points here were, it was a 2-day event, and there were 400 people in person, and it was streamed on the first day internationally. And there were people all over the world. They kept showing, you know, where attendees were, and it was literally internationally. So the focus was on how they're collaborating, ways they're collaborating, and then they focused on providing their perspective and the importance of sponsor oversight, both clinical sites and laboratories, the e-source, which are all big topics right now, and protocol deviations and the impact on clinical trials, and then challenges for novel clinical trial designs, which is very applicable now as we're changing. Many of us are changing how we run studies, so we're using now a lot of those adaptive trial designs and decentralized trial designs. So next slide. This is just a snapshot of the first day, the agenda, and I'm going to touch on, I have slides touching on the update on international collaboration as well as protocol deviations. But also, which was really great opportunities, were panel discussions and opportunities to speak directly with the inspectors during breaks and lunch. And you know, that was really, really useful because they were very candid, and, you know, both in the panel session and of course, one-to-one. Next slide. So some ways they're collaborating, that they are information sharing. So they're actually meeting quarterly to discuss common GCP issues, and of course, having collaborative inspections, because they do realize that they want to make sure that they're aligned with GCPs and how they're being applied. Next slide. So this is some ways that some different types of collaborative inspections, and I'm just going to take a minute to go through this. So one way is having a joint inspection where both the FDA and the MHRA are on site at the same time or overlapping times. And interestingly, there's only been 2 so far. The first one I had the pleasure of experiencing back in January of 2019, and there's been only 1 additional one since then. But I did hear at the TMF Summit that there have been some joint FDA EMA inspections. We've all been aware, and we've heard about observational inspections where there's been one agency doing the inspection and another agency simply observing. So I've observed that. My last EMA inspection, the FDA was present and they just purely observed. So they've been doing that for quite a while, but now they're starting to do actual joint inspections. Parallel and sequential are other options. They didn't really go into too much detail with that. Next slide. So again, just the purpose of collaboration, just to make sure that, to compare really their findings, they want to understand if they're looking at the same thing, where they have similarities and differences. And interestingly, during the panel discussion, it was specifically noted that one major difference, well, one thing that's good is that they noted that there were more similarities than differences. But one thing that was called out by an FDA inspector specifically was that the FDA is not as concerned as the MHRA and the EMA with TMF
timeliness, submission timeliness, that they do care more about that it being there, being complete. But as we all know, the MHRA and the EMA, the first thing they do is run a report to see when things were submitted compared to when they should be submitted. The FDA doesn't do that as much, so they're not concerned that way. So, but again, it was good to hear that they do mostly think alike and they're focusing on most of the same things. They're sharing intelligence. This is another thing that came up. So, you know, for example, they do share findings amongst each other. So maybe, you know, they might select a site audit based on whether or not someone else has been there or not. So they do try to leverage findings from other agencies to an extent, but they did mention that they do plan to maybe utilize that more. So these are some challenges, and not surprisingly, with the new designs and new trial methodology, this is posing a challenge to them because they have to figure out how to assess these. Same thing with new technologies. You know, the e-sources are a big focus, and of course, telemedicine, mobile technology. Next slide. And again, moving forward, they're just looking into common findings, ways they can work, opportunities to provide guidance, and you know, process improvement. I just wanted to talk about protocol deviations a bit because the presentations were really good on this. And you know, one thing that I was surprised to realize that it isn't protocol deviation, protocol waiver, the terminology isn't clearly defined in any of the regulations, really. So they recognize this. They said they recognize there's a lack of clear definitions. So they tried to point out some issues, and you know, they said there's a need to more effectively and efficiently leverage the deviation data. Just, you know, first and foremost is to protect the rights, safety and welfare of the trial participants and ensure the data is, you know, solid for them to make decisions. So they pointed out, you know, where the gaps are, and, you know, the definitions, the process deviations, and then with regards to data standards such as CDISC. And then tracking, this is a big thing, and I think we all struggle with this, just tracking protocol deviations. We have multiple systems, lack of system interoperability, and this results in limitations on the ability to identify, track, analyze, and report. And that was touched on, that was a common theme throughout as well, that the deviations come from different areas, and they have to make sure that what ends up in the CSR is, you know, consistent with what's found, you know, throughout the study. Next slide. Just the regulatory expectations were spelled out, that, you know, that the data and documentation has to permit them to reconstruct the conduct of the study and understand how sponsors have determined important versus non-important. This goes back to the lack of clear definitions. So it's important that there be consistency and that this somehow be clear on how a company is determining if something's important versus not important for protocol deviations. And they want to see evidence that oversight obligations are maintained, so document risk assessments, tracking, analysis, and then the MHRA serious breach reporting. Next slide. So this was interesting. This was from Jenny Martin, gave a good presentation, and she, this was part of hers, and she spelled out what does a good process look like. So she made it very clear. So from their perspective, this is what a good process looks like. So they want you to identify all trial deviations, whether it be protocol, GCP, SOPs, trial procedures, record and log all identified deviations from the sponsor, the CRO or vendor, the investigator site, contemporaneous documentation of review and assessment, the who, when, the decision, the outcome, whether or not there's a CAPA, and then appropriate circulations and escalations. So whether it's a serious breach, that there was regulatory notification where applicable, something was removed from the statistical analysis, and then inclusion in the CSR and the appendices. Next slide. And I'm picking and choosing here. So day two, just real quick, was there were two sessions that it consisted of case studies. So each session you had two choices of which group you wanted to be in. So it was either bioanalytical approaches to mitigate issues identified during bioequivalence clinical site inspection, or GCP ePro source data. The underlined one is the one I attended. And then for the second session, it was either laboratory audit trails or handling protocol deviations. And I just included who gave the sessions, who moderated the sessions, that you get a feel for those of you who know who the different regulators are. So again, just focusing on protocol deviations, you know, what was nice was for these sessions, they gave you time as a group to go through, putting on your inspector hat and go through and you know, come up with what you feel the issues are with this fake study you were given. And then at the end, they go through and they ask everybody to submit what we thought the questions the inspectors would have. And then they went and they presented their own findings, so their own thoughts. So I thought that was very valuable, because here are the questions that they would have. So this is directly from them. So they want to know how the deviations are identified, recorded, reconciled, and categorized. I'm not going to read through the whole slide, but the important points are that, you know, mapping out all sources of deviations, reviewing the procedures, ensuring you have listings for all the deviations identified, if there's any data integrity concerns related to the conduct of the study, and importantly, the impact assessment. Was there an impact assessment performed? Was there any impact on the analysis? And this is very relevant to what we're dealing with now as well. And I think there's only one more slide, or that might be it. Oh, one more. So just common root causes. So again, what I said earlier, just again, the same theme throughout the different presenters was that, you know, you had to make sure you got all the deviations, that there was you had some methodology to bring everything together, review the deviations from all the different sources, all the functional groups, departments, and that you had a quality management system in place. Hope I didn't
Wendy,
talk too fast. Any questions?
Wendy, thank you very much. That was brilliant in terms of speeding up, in terms of information. The slides will all be going out. I'm aware that we are slightly over time and we're slowly starting to lose people. So if anybody has any questions, please feel free to contact Wendy directly or email me and I will put you in touch with Wendy. I don't think we've actually got time for questions. I'm really sorry, Wendy.
That's fine. I have slides for the presentations too. So if anybody wanted to see any of the presentations I didn't speak to, I'd be happy to share them.
Yeah, I'll make sure your email address is on the slides, which I think it is. So no problem at all. Just a couple of things before you go. DIA is still on, so maybe we'll see you at some stage in DIA. I'm sort of feeling that it might not be, but anyway. But IQPC in Bruges in September and EXL in London in October, they're definitely still on as far as conferences. Next meeting, 11th of May, I will be circulating the meeting. We'll also be putting in the meetings for the year, so that we've got everything you need. And if anybody wants to know anything about the reference model. And last but absolutely not least, I just wanted to show you that I've just got my voting. This is what your email vote should look like, sent to you, and then you just have to click on that and vote for your I think it's anything up to 5 people. So thank you very, very much, everybody. I really appreciate everybody's focus and all of the presenters, and stay well, everybody, and take care. Oh, you can't see my voting email. Thank you, Sarah. That's because I've clearly not shared the right thing. So I will share that. And now you can see my voting email. There you are. So thanks, everybody. Take care. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Karen. Thanks, everyone.
Absolutely.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.